This is a true story of a traumatic event experienced by a person who was kidnapped but wishes to remain anonymous, so we will call her Laura. Laura had a routine that seemed so safe, so predictable. Every morning was a repetition of the previous one. She woke up early, prepared coffee, and got ready for another day of classes on campus. There was an almost comforting tranquility in her life, a sense of control over the small things around her. She wasn't someone who sought out strong emotions or unexpected adventures. Her days were filled with studies, walks to campus, and occasional visits to places she liked, such as a nearby bookstore. Her life seemed to follow such a well-defined, ordinary course. But sometimes, things begin to change without the person immediately noticing. Small, almost imperceptible details start to reveal themselves. At first, Laura just felt a slight unease, a sense that something was out of place. It was as if, amid her meticulously planned routine, there was a presence she couldn't define, a shadow that, little by little, began to stretch over her peaceful life. It was on the way to campus that Laura began to notice. At first glance, it seemed like just a coincidence. The same vehicle appearing at different points on her route, the same model, the same color. However, as the days passed, the coincidence ceased to seem so innocent. More and more, she felt the driver's eyes watching her, and the shadow of a premonition began to grow inside her. The routine, once so secure, now seemed to harbor something sinister, something she still couldn't fully understand. But that initial unease, that first sensation of being watched, would be just the beginning of a spiral of fear that was about to take over her life. As the days passed, Laura's feeling of being watched intensified. The same vehicle, a dark-colored truck, seemed to always be nearby. At first, she tried to ignore it, rationalizing that it was just a coincidence. Perhaps it was the same route as someone living in the same area. But the frequency with which she saw it began to undermine that justification. No matter the time of day, the truck was there. On the mornings when she left earlier or the days when she returned late, the presence of that vehicle was a constant. It was as if the driver knew her every move, anticipating every route she took. The thought that she was being followed began to infiltrate Laura's mind, making it impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while driving to the bookstore, something disturbing happened. Laura noticed the truck in her rearview mirror as usual, but this time it seemed even closer, as if it wanted her to know she was being followed. Her heart began to beat faster, and a sense of dread took over her body. She tried changing her route, turning onto side streets, taking paths she wouldn't normally take. Each time she thought she had lost the truck, it reappeared, always behind her, always keeping a distance that seemed calculated to be intimidating, but not alarming enough to attract the attention of other drivers. Laura's mind was on high alert. Her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as her breathing became increasingly short and rapid. She began to question whether she should go to the police, but she felt ridiculous considering it with so little to report beyond a premonition. What if she was just imagining things? What if, somehow, it was just paranoia? However, the sense of danger was palpable. Every fiber of Laura's body was screaming that something was very wrong. She parked the car at the bookstore, her hands still trembling, and watched through the rearview mirror. The truck stopped a little further back, with the driver remaining inside. She couldn't see his face, but she felt his gaze, penetrating, as if she could feel his eyes cutting through the darkness that separated them. Something inside her knew that this was no coincidence. This man was waiting, watching, and there was a reason for it. Fear began to transform into a suffocating dread, a sense that something terrible was about to happen. And deep down, Laura knew this was just the beginning of the nightmare she was about to live. Laura sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to control her rapid breathing. Her eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror, watching the truck that remained parked a few meters behind. The driver made no move to exit, but the presence of that imposing and silent vehicle seemed to fill the air around her with unbearable tension. After what felt like hours, Laura finally decided to get out of the car. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but she knew she couldn't stay there forever. Trying to appear natural, she grabbed her bag and stepped out of the vehicle, locking the door with a click that sounded too loud in the quiet afternoon. As she walked towards the bookstore, she felt the weight of a gaze on her back. She knew the truck's driver was watching her every move. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she needed all her willpower not to look back. She entered the bookstore, and the door closed behind her with the faint tinkle of a bell, which somehow sounded like a temporary relief, a small barrier between her and the unknown. Inside, the bookstore was quiet, with only a few people browsing books or whispering in hushed tones. The familiarity of the place gave Laura a momentary sense of safety, as if the book-lined walls could protect her from whatever was out there. She walked through the aisles, trying to seem calm, but her mind was on high alert, replaying the image of the truck following her. She stopped in front of a shelf, pretending to be interested in a random book, while her mind worked at full speed. Could the truck driver be someone she knew, someone from campus? No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't recall anyone who fit that description. It was as if the man was wrapped in a shroud of anonymity, a faceless shadow watching from a distance. After a few minutes, Laura decided it was time to leave. The simple act of choosing a book and heading to the checkout felt almost surreal, as if she was acting on autopilot. While the bookstore clerk scanned the book, Laura cast a quick glance outside the window. The truck was still there, parked, unmoving. She knew she couldn't return to the car without doing something, but what? Going straight to the police with little more than a hunch seemed extreme, but ignoring the danger could be even worse. With the book in hand, she left the bookstore and hesitated for a moment on the sidewalk. Fear and adrenaline coursed through her veins, but reason's voice screamed that she needed to stay strong. Laura took a step toward the car, but before she could reach it, something unexpected happened. The truck's headlights turned on, illuminating her with an intense glare that made her stop abruptly. The sound of the engine roaring to life echoed down the quiet street, making her heart nearly leap out of her chest. She stood paralyzed for a moment, unsure of what to expect. Then, as if the driver was sending a warning, the truck slowly moved toward her, stopping just a few meters away. Fear turned into palpable panic. Laura didn't wait to see what would happen next. She ran back to the car, unlocked the door with trembling hands, and got in quickly, locking it immediately afterward. The truck was still there, headlights on, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. She knew she couldn't stay there. She started the car and, without looking back, sped away, leaving the bookstore and that sinister vehicle behind. But the feeling of being hunted, of being watched by something or someone with malicious intent, remained. As she drove through the dark streets, she felt that the real danger was yet to come, and this was only the beginning of something much darker. Laura drove aimlessly for a while, trying to get as far away from the bookstore and that lurking truck as possible. The deserted streets and the silence of the night only amplified the echo of her confused and frightened thoughts. What disturbed her the most was the uncertainty. Who was that person? What did he want? And why was he after her? She finally decided to stop at a well-lit gas station. She needed a moment to breathe, to think about what to do next. She parked the car near the convenience store and sat for a few minutes, still gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down. The truck didn't seem to have followed her there, but the fear persisted, like a shadow that refused to disappear. Laura decided to enter the convenience store. The fluorescent light's brightness and the presence of other people provided a minimal sense of security. She grabbed a bottle of water and headed to the counter, trying to act normally, even though her mind was a whirlwind of panic and uncertainty. As she paid for the water, her eyes scanned the parking lot through the windows. Nothing seemed out of place. No sign of the truck that had followed her before. Maybe she had finally lost the driver, or maybe he had given up. Still, something inside her couldn't shake the feeling that it was far from over. As she exited the convenience store, Laura was suddenly overwhelmed by a sense of alertness. She stopped at the door, looking around once more. The cold night wind made her shiver, but it wasn't that which made her tense. There, across the street, in the shadows, she saw a figure. It wasn't the truck this time, but the silhouette of a man, standing still, watching her. He was far enough away that she couldn't see his face clearly, but his immobile posture, the way he seemed to be fixated on her, was enough to make her blood run cold. For a moment, Laura was paralyzed, unsure of what to do. The man didn't move, just continued to watch her, as if waiting for some kind of reaction. Her mind began to spin with terrifying possibilities. What if it was the same man from the truck? What if he had gotten out of the vehicle to follow her on foot? She knew she needed to get out of there, and quickly. With quick, almost running steps, she returned to the car, unlocking it with trembling hands. She got in and locked the doors immediately, her eyes fixed on the figure that was still there, unmoving. There was no more time for hesitation. Laura started the car and accelerated, leaving the gas station behind. In the rearview mirror, the man's figure diminished until it disappeared into the darkness. But even as she drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, still following her somehow. As the night wore on and the streets grew more deserted, Laura knew she needed to make a decision. She couldn't keep fleeing aimlessly, hoping the fear would disappear on its own. She needed to seek help. She needed a plan. But even as she thought about this, a new and terrifying possibility began to creep into her mind. What if he knew where she lived? What if the pursuit didn't end, even if she managed to escape again? The fear she felt was rooted in the idea that there was no way to know how far he would go, how much he already knew about her. And it was then that Laura realized that, somehow, that man had already entered her life more deeply than she cared to admit. The pursuit wasn't just physical, it was beginning to invade her mind, her sanity, and every thought of hers was colored by the terror he brought with him. But one thing was certain, this wouldn't end easily, and Laura had no idea how far this situation could go. Laura drove through unknown streets, trying to get further and further away from that disturbing encounter. The feeling of being watched accompanied her, even as the world around her seemed to dissolve into the darkness of the night. The deserted streets offered little safety, and every car's headlights that appeared on the horizon made her heart race, fearing that the nightmare was far from over. Determined not to go home, Laura headed to campus, a place that, despite the late hour, still offered some sense of familiarity and security. She parked the car near the main building, where a few lights were still on, and got out, quickly locking the vehicle. The silence around her was heavy, almost palpable, as if the environment itself was conspiring to amplify her fear. As she walked across campus, the night stillness was interrupted only by the sound of her own footsteps. The shadows of trees and tall buildings created unsettling shapes that danced at the edges of her vision. Laura knew she needed to find a safe place, maybe the library, which usually stayed open late for students. She needed a moment to compose herself, to think of a plan. When she reached the library, she felt a small relief seeing that the glass doors were still open. She entered hastily, feeling the warmth and soft light inside welcoming her as a temporary refuge. There were only a few students scattered around the hall, studying quietly. Laura headed to a table in the corner, away from the windows, and tried to calm herself. While sitting there, her mind began to reconstruct the night's events. Something was terribly wrong, and the fact that the man from the truck, or whoever he was, had followed her to the gas station only reinforced the idea that this was personal. He knew more about her than he should, and that thought made her shiver. She took out her phone, considering calling the police. But what would she say? That she was being followed by a mysterious man? That she had seen someone standing in the darkness watching her? Without more details, she feared her report wouldn't be taken seriously. And worse, the doubt crept into her mind. What if he was already nearby, listening to her call? The fear that he might know more about her than seemed reasonable prevented her from making any calls. As she pondered, Laura felt a presence. Not physical, but a sense that something was wrong. She looked up and around. The few students in the library seemed oblivious to what was happening. But in the distance, near the entrance, she saw movement. There he was, the same man, standing outside the library, looking directly at her through the glass doors. Laura felt panic rise like a tidal wave. He had followed her there. Somehow, he knew exactly where she was. And now he was there, waiting, unhurried, as if he knew she had nowhere to run. For a moment, Laura was frozen. There was nowhere to escape inside the library, and the idea of going out the front door was out of the question. Her heart pounded, and she felt sweat trickling down her forehead. She needed to find a way to get out of there without him following her. She quickly got up, but without drawing attention, and headed to the back of the library, where there was an emergency exit. Her hands trembled as she pushed the heavy door, which opened with a slight creak. The door led to a side street on campus, poorly lit, but at least she was out of the stalker's sight. Laura rushed out, looking around, trying to decide where to go. But before she could take a few more steps, she heard something behind her, the sound of footsteps. He was coming. The panic that engulfed her was so intense it almost paralyzed her. But Laura forced herself to run, desperately searching for a place to hide, knowing that with every passing moment, he was getting closer. The run through the darkness of the campus seemed to lead nowhere safe. The shadows around her seemed to close in on her, as if the environment itself was conspiring to corner her. But Laura knew she had to keep going, that her only chance was not to stop. As she ran, she felt the weight of his gaze on her, as if he could see her no matter where she was. And it was at that moment that Laura realized, with terrifying clarity, that the nightmare wouldn't end so soon. He was determined to follow her, no matter where she went, and the real terror was just beginning. Laura ran through the shadows of the campus, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the deserted streets. The darkness around her seemed more oppressive with each passing moment, as if it was closing in on her, suffocating any hope of finding a safe place. The fear that drove her now mixed with exhaustion, but she knew she couldn't stop. He was nearby, of that she was sure. As she ran, her mind was torn between the urgent need to escape and the growing certainty that she had fallen into a carefully laid trap. How did he know where she was? How could he follow her so closely without her noticing? None of it made sense, and it was this lack of logic that made everything even more terrifying. Laura turned a corner and found herself in an old campus building, one of the few that still had lights on. She recognized it as the administration building, a place that was usually empty at that time of night, but now seemed to be her only chance to hide. Without thinking twice, she ran to the door and pushed it, feeling relief when it opened. Inside, the silence was dense, interrupted only by the sound of her rapid breaths. The flickering fluorescent lights cast distorted shadows on the walls, heightening the oppressive atmosphere. Laura closed the door behind her, locking it, and began walking down the narrow corridors, trying to find a place where she could hide. Laura turned a corner and found herself in an old campus building, one of the few that still had lights on. She recognized it as the administration building, a place that was usually empty at that time of night but now seemed to be her only chance to hide. Without thinking twice, she ran to the door and pushed it, feeling relief when it opened. Inside, the silence was dense, interrupted only by the sound of her rapid breaths. The flickering fluorescent lights cast distorted shadows on the walls, heightening the oppressive atmosphere. Laura closed the door behind her, locking it, and began walking down the narrow corridors, trying to find a place where she could hide. The absolute silence in the room was broken only by the sound of her labored breathing and the occasional creak of the old building, groaning under the weight of the years. Laura stayed there, trying to calm herself, trying to think. What if the truck driver, or whoever he was, had followed her into the building? What if he was just waiting for her to come out of hiding? The idea that he might be out there, just waiting, made her stomach churn. Suddenly, she heard something, a low, almost imperceptible sound, but it made her heart jump. Footsteps. Soft footsteps, as if someone was trying not to make any noise. They were getting closer, each step echoing down the silent corridor. Laura held her breath, trying to make herself invisible. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Time seemed to freeze as she waited, every muscle in her body tense, expecting the worst. Did he know she was there? Had he trapped her? Silence reigned again, but Laura didn't allow herself to relax. She remained still, waiting, listening. And then, with a bang, the doorknob turned. The door opened slowly, the creak of the hinges cutting through the air like a knife. Laura shrank further behind the shelf, trying to hide in the shadows. For a brief moment, everything was silent again. No movement, no sound. And then, the light of a flashlight swept across the room, scanning the environment. Laura held her breath again, hoping the shadows were enough to hide her. The flashlight illuminated the floor, the shelves, but didn't reach the corner where Laura was. After what felt like an eternity, the light disappeared, and she heard the door close softly. The footsteps retreated, gradually fading until they disappeared completely. Laura let out a sigh she didn't know she was holding, her entire body trembling with relief and fear. He was gone, at least for now, but the panic remained, a constant presence that wouldn't leave her alone. She knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. She needed to find a way to get out of there, to escape this nightmare before he returned. But one thing was certain. Laura was being hunted, and this cat-and-mouse game was far from over. And as she remained there, alone, surrounded by darkness, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever be able to escape. Laura stood still for long minutes, each second feeling like an eternity. The silence in the archive room was almost deafening, and the darkness seemed to close in around her, making the air heavier and harder to breathe. She knew she couldn't stay there forever. She needed to leave, but the fear that he might still be nearby was paralyzing. Finally, gathering all the courage she had left, Laura decided it was time to move. With extreme care, she rose from her hiding place and approached the door, listening intently for any sign of movement on the other side. The hallway was engulfed in almost total darkness, and the silence was deep, unsettling. She opened the door slowly, peeking out. There was no sign of the man, but that didn't reassure her. His absence only heightened the feeling that he could be anywhere, waiting to strike. Laura began to walk down the corridor, each step careful and silent, the sound of her own shoes against the floor echoing in her ears like a distant drum. As she neared the end of the corridor, she noticed something that made her stop. A faint bluish light came from one of the rooms ahead, from a door slightly ajar that shouldn't have been lit at that hour. The soft glow seemed to draw her eyes, and against her better judgment, Laura approached to see what it was. Reaching the door, she saw that the light came from a computer screen, switched on in a corner of the room. The monitor displayed a series of security cameras, with different angles of the campus being streamed in real time. Laura looked at the screen, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. It was the security room of the building, something she hadn't expected to find there. But what really made her blood run cold was one of the screens, showing footage from inside the very archive room where she had just been hiding. The video clearly showed her silhouette, crouched behind the shelf, breathing heavily. She realized, horrified, that he had known exactly where she was the entire time. He had been watching her every move, like a predator observing its prey. A chill ran down her spine as she comprehended the extent of the danger she was in. He had control over more than just the physical chase. Somehow, he had access to the campus security cameras, which meant he could have been watching her for much longer than she had imagined. Laura felt a rising panic, but also an urge to fight back. Desperate to uncover more, she began searching for something that could give her a clue about who he was or why he was doing this. As she rifled through the desk, she found a notepad with scribbled notes, but nothing that made immediate sense. Then something caught her attention. A small audio recording left open in one of the computer windows. With trembling fingers, Laura pressed play, and the sound of heavy breathing filled the room. Then, a low, menacing male voice began to speak. "You're doing well, Laura, very well, but the game is just beginning." She froze, fear turning into pure terror. He knew her name. He was playing with her, enjoying the fear that consumed her. And worse, he was always one step ahead, controlling her every move. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, breaking the heavy silence. He was getting closer. Without thinking twice, Laura turned off the monitor, plunging the room into darkness, and hid in the shadows, trying to control her breathing. The footsteps stopped in front of the door. The handle slowly turned, and the door opened, revealing the figure of the man. He was shrouded in darkness, but Laura could see the gleam of his eyes as they scanned the room. He knew she was there, and he was relishing the fear he was provoking. She shrank further into the shadows, fighting the urge to scream. She knew that any false move could be her last. And it was at that moment that Laura realized the terrible truth. This wasn't just a game of chase. He was feeding on her fear, using it to corner her, to break her down, step by step. But she wasn't willing to give up so easily. The fight for her life had just begun, and Laura was determined to get out of this situation, even if it meant facing her worst fears to do so. The sound of footsteps suddenly stopped, and Laura felt trapped in a silent nightmare. She knew he was there, on the other side of the room, lurking in the shadows, but she didn't dare move a muscle. Her breathing was light, almost non-existent, as she tried to remain hidden. The darkness seemed alive, each shadow a possible hiding place, but also a threat. Laura squinted, trying to see something in the dim light, but all she could make out was the vague silhouette of the man, motionless at the entrance to the room. He didn't advance, as if savoring the fear that filled the space. For a moment, nothing happened. The tension in the air was palpable, and Laura felt that at any second he could move, reveal himself, and end everything. But then, to her surprise, he slowly turned and left the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Laura remained motionless, her heart pounding in her chest, waiting to see if it was some kind of trap. Maybe he was trying to lure her out, only to catch her off guard. After a few minutes of absolute silence, Laura finally allowed herself to breathe a little deeper. She wasn't sure if he had really left, but she knew she couldn't stay there forever. She needed to escape, and quickly. The fact that he had walked away, even for a brief moment, could be her only chance. Laura got up slowly, her movements cautious, still fearing that he might just be waiting outside. She tried to open the door, but stopped when she heard a low noise coming from the hallway. It seemed distant, but it was enough to make her body contract in fear again. She needed to be fast, but she also needed a plan. She decided that the only way out of there was to find an alternative exit, something he wasn't expecting. She remembered that the building had an old ventilation system that connected several rooms, an old and decaying construction that, under normal circumstances, she would never use. But now, it was her only hope. Laura began looking for the nearest vent, her eyes adjusting to the darkness of the room. Finally, she found one, leaning against the back wall. It was small, but with a bit of effort, she might be able to squeeze through. She approached and started removing the rusty screws, her fingers trembling, trying to make as little noise as possible. At every little creak, she stopped, holding her breath, hoping he hadn't heard her, but the hallway remained silent. When she finally managed to remove the grate, Laura looked into the dark tunnel ahead. It wasn't inviting, but it was the only way out. She squeezed through the small space, feeling the cold metal against her skin. The tunnel was tight, and every movement seemed to echo through the ventilation system, as if announcing her location. Laura crawled slowly, forcing herself to continue, even when fear threatened to paralyze her. The air inside the tunnel was heavy, filled with dust and moisture, and each breath was an effort. But Laura knew she couldn't stop. If he found out where she was going, it would be the end. The darkness around her enveloped her completely, and the only sound she heard was the pounding of her own heart. As she crawled, she heard something that made her blood run cold, a metallic sound, like a grate being removed. He was behind her. She didn't know how, but somehow he knew exactly where she was. The sound of his pursuit echoed through the tunnels, getting closer and closer. Laura tried to speed up, but the space was so tight that moving faster was almost impossible. Panic grew, and she felt the air running out, as if the tunnel itself was conspiring to suffocate her. But giving up wasn't an option. She needed to get out of there. Finally, she saw a beam of light ahead, an exit. With renewed determination, Laura pushed toward the light, feeling the fresh air outside getting closer. But the sounds of his pursuit were also nearer, as if he was almost by her side. Laura reached the exit grate, pushed it hard, and with a final desperate effort, launched herself out of the tunnel, falling into a small, dark alley. She barely had time to compose herself before hearing the metallic sound of the grate being replaced behind her. He was very close. Without a second thought, Laura stood up and started running down the alley, not looking back. She knew he was behind her, but she also knew she was closer to freedom. Adrenaline pushed her, and the only thing that mattered now was to keep moving. The alley was narrow, filled with obstacles, but Laura didn't stop. The sound of the footsteps behind her was weaker, as if he was losing ground, but she didn't allow herself to relax. She knew the danger was still there, and that she would need all her strength to escape this nightmare. Finally, the alley opened into a deserted street, and Laura saw, in the distance, the lights of a busy avenue. It was her chance to blend into the crowd, to disappear. With her heart racing, she ran toward the avenue, hoping that once there, she would finally be safe. But even as she ran toward the apparent safety, the feeling that something dark and relentless was still behind her didn't leave her. And Laura knew, deep down, that this fight was far from over. Laura reached the busy avenue, the glow of the city lights contrasting with the oppressive darkness from which she had just emerged. The sight of people walking, cars passing by, gave her a brief sense of security, as if the nightmare chasing her was being left behind. She slowed down, trying to appear calm, trying to blend in with the crowd, but the adrenaline was still rushing through her veins, and fear was a constant companion. As she walked along the sidewalk, Laura tried to think about what to do next. She knew she couldn't go home, and the campus was no longer safe. But more than anything, she knew he was still out there, watching, waiting. The feeling that he was always one step ahead continued to haunt her. The fact that he had access to the security cameras, that he knew exactly where she was, indicated that the game he was playing was far more complex than just a simple physical chase. She decided to enter a 24-hour cafe, a place where she could think without attracting too much attention. She sat at a table in the back, where she could observe the entrance and windows. She ordered a coffee, more to have something to do with her hands than to actually drink it. Her eyes constantly scanned the environment, searching for any sign of danger. While she waited, she began to reflect on everything that had happened. How did he know so much about her? How was he able to be everywhere she was? The idea that he had access to her life in ways she hadn't even imagined terrified her. He wasn't just chasing her. He was playing with her mind, twisting her thoughts, making her question every move, every decision. The coffee arrived and Laura held the cup, feeling the warmth against her cold hands. She needed to think clearly, but it was difficult when every fiber of her being was on high alert. She knew the only way out of this situation was to understand what he wanted, what his objective was. But how to do that without falling into more traps? Then her phone vibrated on the table, interrupting her thoughts. She looked at the screen and felt her blood run cold. It was a message from an unknown number. With trembling hands, she opened the message and read the words that made her feel as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "You can't hide, Laura. I know where you are. I've always known." She looked around frantically, searching for him, but everything seemed normal. The people in the cafe were absorbed in their own lives, oblivious to the terror consuming her. But Laura knew he was there somewhere, watching her. The mind game had reached a new level, and she felt like she was losing control. The fear returned with full force, and Laura abruptly stood up, leaving the cafe behind. She began to walk quickly down the sidewalk, trying not to run so as not to attract attention, but the panic was becoming harder to control. He was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. How can someone fight against that? Every person who passed her on the street seemed like a potential threat. Laura felt exposed, vulnerable, as if at any moment he could emerge from the shadows and finish what he had started. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step. Then her phone vibrated again. Another message. "There's no point in running, Laura. I'll always find you." Panic turned to despair. She had nowhere to go, no way to escape. He wasn't just following her. He was manipulating every aspect of her life, turning her into a prisoner of her own fear. And suddenly, Laura realized that his true goal wasn't to capture her physically, but to break her mentally. He was playing a much more dangerous game, a game in which the prize was her sanity. She knew she couldn't go on like this. She needed to turn the tables somehow, to find a way to reverse the situation, to beat him at his own game. But how? The sense of helplessness was overwhelming, but Laura forced herself to think. There had to be a way to win this. There had to be. Determined, she decided she would no longer run. No matter how terrified she was, she would not let him control her. It was time to face the fear head-on, to confront the unknown that was pursuing her. If he wanted a game, she was ready to play. But as she formulated a plan in her mind, one last message appeared on her phone screen, bringing with it a new level of horror. "It's time to end the game, Laura. I'm closer than you think." The last message drove a cold fear into Laura's heart. She looked around, feeling as if the air around her was becoming denser, more suffocating. He was close, very close. The thought that he might be watching her, perhaps only a few meters away, sent her mind spiraling. Laura knew she needed to act quickly, but panic threatened to overwhelm her. Her breathing quickened, and she struggled to concentrate. He was playing with her, trying to break her, but Laura couldn't give in. She forced herself to take a deep breath and began walking, blending into the crowd on the avenue, trying to maintain the appearance of calm, but with her heart racing frantically. Each step seemed to echo in her mind as she glanced furtively at the faces around her. Every stranger who passed was a potential threat, every shadow a possible trap. She knew she needed to get out of there, needed to find a place where she could think, plan her next move without the constant feeling of being watched. But where to go? The campus wasn't safe, her home was out of the question, and he seemed to have eyes everywhere. Laura remembered an old library, hidden in a less busy part of town, a place few people knew about. Maybe there she could find a moment of peace, a chance to reassess her situation. Decided, she hailed a taxi at the corner and asked the driver to take her to the library. The ride seemed endless, each red light prolonging the terror she felt. The driver, oblivious to what was happening, kept a casual conversation, which Laura barely heard. She was entirely absorbed by fear and the feeling that something was about to happen. When they finally reached the library, Laura quickly paid and got out of the car, feeling the cold night air against her face. The library was enveloped in silence, the dim lights illuminating the old building. It was a place that exuded tranquility, but Laura knew that this calm was superficial. She entered quickly, seeking refuge among the old and dusty shelves. The silence inside the library was almost oppressive, but at the same time, it offered a welcome contrast to the chaos that reigned in her mind. Laura headed to the back of the building, to a rarely frequented section where she could hide and think without being interrupted. She sat in an old armchair, hidden in a corner between the shelves, and finally allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment, trying to calm her nerves. But the tranquility didn't last long. The phone vibrated again in her hand, pulling her out of any hope of peace. With a sinking feeling in her stomach, Laura looked at the screen. Another message. "Do you like the library, Laura? A good place to end, don't you think?" Horror gripped her. He knew where she was. How? Laura felt the blood drain from her face, the sense of security crumbling completely. He was there, somewhere, and she was more cornered than ever. Suddenly, a soft sound echoed through the library. Footsteps. Slowly, Laura stood up, trying not to make any noise, her senses on high alert. The footsteps grew closer, reverberating through the old walls, coming closer and closer. She tried to think of a plan, but the fear was paralyzing. The sound of the footsteps resounded in her mind, each heartbeat matching the terrifying rhythm. Laura hid behind a shelf, peeking carefully through the gap between the books. The dim light barely illuminated the corridors, and the shadows danced on the walls, creating distorted shapes that made her heart race faster. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was even more disturbing. She knew he was there, but where? Suddenly, a figure appeared on the other side of the corridor. He was standing, lurking, with his head slightly tilted, as if he was listening, trying to catch any sign of movement. Laura's heart raced. She was so close to him that she could almost feel his physical presence. The air around her felt heavier, more suffocating. But then he started moving again, slowly, like a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to flee. Laura knew she was trapped, but she also knew she couldn't let him see her. In a silent move, she began to back away, retreating to the darkest part of the library, where the lights didn't reach. Every step she took felt like an eternity, the tension building up in her body to the breaking point. She heard his footsteps following, always keeping a calculated distance, as if he was playing with her, savoring the terror he was inflicting. Finally, Laura reached a door at the end of the corridor. It was an emergency exit, her last hope of escaping this nightmare. With her heart in her throat, she pushed the door, hoping the sound wouldn't echo too loudly in the silent library. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a narrow, dimly lit staircase that descended to the lower floors of the building. Without thinking twice, Laura quickly descended the stairs, her steps echoing off the concrete walls. With each step, she felt his presence closer, as if the very air was infused with his touch. She knew she needed to get out of there, but the staircase seemed to stretch on forever, each descent a step deeper into an endless abyss. Finally, Laura reached the lowest level of the library, a large, dimly lit room filled with old files and dusty furniture. She ran to the back of the room, desperately searching for an exit. But to her horror, the only door she found was locked, and the window was too small for her to pass through. The sound of footsteps returned, descending the stairs, closer and closer. Laura looked around, desperately searching for a hiding place. There was an old, large cabinet in the corner of the room. With no alternatives, she ran to it, opening the door and curling up inside, trying to calm her breathing, which came in short, shallow gasps. The silence returned, oppressive, as she waited. The footsteps stopped upstairs, and she knew he was searching, tracking her, knowing she was close. The feeling of being cornered was overwhelming, but Laura forced herself to stay in control. She knew this could be the end of the game, but she wasn't going to surrender without a fight. Then the silence was broken by the sound of a door being opened slowly. He was on the same floor. Laura felt the terror consume her last reserves of courage, but she held firm. She was trapped, but she still had hope of escaping. And as she waited, she knew that this was the decisive moment. The moment that would determine whether she would survive or become just another victim in the sick game he had set up. Laura huddled inside the old cabinet, her eyes adjusted to the darkness, desperately trying to listen for any sound that might indicate his proximity. The silence around her was suffocating. Each passing second seemed to stretch infinitely, increasing the weight of fear in her chest. Her mind raced in circles, trying to find a way out, But the reality of the situation was inescapable. She was trapped with no escape, and he was getting closer. His footsteps echoed through the lower floor, resonating through the cold ground and concrete walls, each sound closer than the last. Laura could feel his presence, even without seeing him, as if the darkness around her was alive, pulsating with the imminent threat. The cabinet was fragile protection, a temporary shelter she knew could be discovered at any moment. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, as it indicated he was listening, searching for any sign of her. Laura tried to control her breathing, keeping as quiet as possible. But the panic made her heart pound, as if it were about to explode in her chest. Then she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, a whisper, low and disturbing, that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Laura, I know you're here." She held her breath, every fiber of her being frozen with terror. The whisper continued, as if he were enjoying himself, savoring every word. "You can't run, Laura. This is our game, and it's almost over." She closed her eyes, fighting against the rising panic, trying to think of something, anything, that could help her get out of this. But the fear was paralyzing, and every sound, every word, seemed to pierce her mind like a cold blade. The footsteps resumed, slowly, as if he were exploring the space around him, searching for her. Laura knew he was playing with her fear, trying to destabilize her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to be discovered. The whisper came back, closer this time, making her skin prickle. "Laura, come play." She bit her lip to keep from screaming, the pressure building inside her, as if she were about to explode. He was so close now, so close that she could feel the air around her growing denser, more suffocating. The cabinet door was a thin barrier, an illusion of safety that she knew wouldn't last. Then the cabinet handle began to turn slowly, the sound of metal scraping against the latch echoing through the space. Laura braced herself for the worst, knowing that he was about to find her, that the game was finally reaching its terrifying climax. But before the door could be fully opened, something unexpected happened. A loud noise, like the sound of something heavy falling upstairs, reverberated through the building, breaking the silence. He stopped abruptly, and Laura heard his breathing become heavier, as if he were considering what to do next. The sound above repeated, a thud that made the old structure of the building tremble slightly. The pursuer hesitated for a moment, and then, to Laura's absolute relief, he closed the cabinet door without opening it completely. She heard his hurried footsteps retreating, climbing the stairs back to the upper floor to investigate what had caused the noise. Laura stayed where she was, unable to move, as she listened to the sounds from above. Something was happening, something he hadn't expected. Her mind raced, trying to process what that meant. Could it be possible that there was someone else there, someone who could help her? Or was it just another part of the sick game he was playing with her? The only thing Laura knew was that this was her chance, perhaps the only one she would have. She would need to act quickly while he was distracted to try to escape that nightmare once and for all. Gathering all the courage she had left, she pushed the cabinet door, stepping out into the dimly lit corridor. The sounds from the upper floor continued, but Laura didn't risk checking what was happening. Instead, she ran toward the exit through which she had entered, knowing that every second counted. Her body trembled, but the determination to escape was stronger than the fear that still gripped her. When she reached the foot of the stairs, she looked up but saw no one. She quickly climbed, each step echoing in her ears like thunder. She needed to get out of there, needed to find help, needed to survive. Finally, she reached the door leading to the main floor. Before leaving, she looked back one last time at the shadows that seemed to stretch behind her, as if they wanted to pull her back into the nightmare from which she was trying to escape. But she didn't hesitate any longer. She pushed the door open and ran for freedom, feeling the cool night air against her face. The terror still pulsed through her veins, but Laura knew this was not just an escape. It was a fight for her very sanity. She ran through the deserted street, not knowing exactly where to go, but certain that she needed to get as far away from that place as possible. And as her footsteps echoed in the silence of the night, a single certainty took hold of her mind. She was still alive, and as long as she was breathing, the game wasn't over yet. Laura ran through the dark streets, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the night as adrenaline kept her senses sharp. The cold dawn air cut across her face, but it couldn't erase the terror that still enveloped her like a shroud. Every shadow, every distant sound seemed like a threat, a constant reminder that he was still out there, perhaps closer than she imagined. She didn't have a clear destination in mind, just the urgent need to get as far away from the library as possible. Her mind still spun around what had happened inside. The whisper, the chase, the unexpected noise that had given her a brief chance to escape. But Laura knew this wasn't the end. He wouldn't give up so easily. As the first lights of the city began to appear on the horizon, Laura realized she needed to find a place to hide, to think about her next step. Exhaustion began to weigh on her body, but fear continued to drive her. Then she spotted an abandoned building, an old hotel that had been closed for years. The broken windows and worn facade indicated that no one had entered there in a long time. Laura hesitated for a moment, but she knew she needed a place to hide, even if only temporarily. The idea of entering such a dark place terrified her, but the fear of staying on the street, vulnerable, was even greater. Determined, she approached the entrance of the hotel, pushing the rusty door that gave way with a disturbing creak. The interior of the hotel was shrouded in darkness and silence. The air was heavy, impregnated with the smell of mold and decay. Laura advanced cautiously, her footsteps echoing through the empty corridors, while her eyes tried to adjust to the lack of light. Every corner seemed to hide something, and the weight of the abandoned building gave the impression that the very walls were watching her. She climbed a narrow staircase, the steps creaking under her weight, and reached the second floor. The doors to the rooms were all open, revealing destroyed interiors, furniture covered in dust, and broken windows that let in the faint light of the moon. Laura chose a room at the back of the corridor, far from the stairs, and entered, closing the door softly behind her. Inside the room, she leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath and organize her thoughts. But the tranquility she hoped to find there was illusory. The feeling of being watched never left her, as if the building itself was impregnated with the same evil that pursued her. Laura tried to calm herself, but the thoughts continued to whirl in her mind. Who was he? Why was he doing this? More and more, it seemed that the game he was playing was much more complex than she could comprehend. And the fact that he was always one step ahead, anticipating her movements, only increased her sense of helplessness. Then something strange happened. A soft sound, almost inaudible, began to resonate through the corridor. It was hard to distinguish what it was. Perhaps the wind passing through the broken windows, or the distant sound of something falling. But gradually, the sound intensified until Laura could hear it clearly. It was the sound of a melody, played by a piano, echoing through the empty building. The sound was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Who would be playing the piano in a place like that? And how did he know she was there? Laura tried to ignore it, but the music seemed to invade her mind, dominating her thoughts, pulling her into a darker place. She slowly stood up, as if in a trance, and left the room, following the sound down the corridor. Every step she took seemed to draw her further into the unknown, and the fear she felt was almost suffocating. But something drove her to continue, a need to discover what was happening, to confront the terror that was pursuing her. Laura descended the stairs again, the sounds of the piano growing louder with each step. When she reached the hotel lobby, she realized that the music was coming from a large hall to the right, where the shadows moved to the rhythm of the melody. She hesitated at the entrance, her heart beating uncontrollably, but the dark curiosity pushed her forward. As she entered the hall, Laura saw a large grand piano in the center of the room, covered in dust but still impressive in its presence. The music abruptly stopped when she entered, and the silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the melody itself. She cautiously approached the piano, her eyes scanning the environment for any sign of movement. But the hall was empty, except for the piano and the darkness that spread in all directions. When she got close enough, she saw something that made her stop. On the piano keys, there was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully. Laura reached out a trembling hand and picked up the sheet, unfolding it slowly. When she read what was written, she felt her blood run cold. "You are where I wanted you, Laura. The game is about to end." Absolute terror took hold of her, and Laura instinctively recoiled, her body trembling with fear. He had anticipated her every move, had prepared every detail, and now she was exactly where he wanted her to be. There was no escape, nowhere to run. Then she heard the sound she feared the most. Footsteps coming from the corridor behind her, approaching slowly. Laura knew he was coming, knew he had cornered her. And as the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty hall, a single certainty took hold of her mind. The real terror was yet to come. Laura was paralyzed by fear as the footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing closer with each passing second. She knew she was trapped, that the game had been designed to bring her precisely to this point. The dark hall around her seemed to close in, as if the walls were shrinking, imprisoning her in an ever smaller space. The darkness was dense, suffocating, and the sound of the approaching footsteps became more threatening with each moment. She tried to think of an escape, but the overwhelming sense that everything was beyond her control made it difficult to breathe. Panic consumed her, making it almost impossible to focus. The piano, with the sheet of paper on its keys, was a silent reminder that he had planned every detail. And now he was coming for her. Finally, the footsteps stopped. Laura couldn't see him, but she could feel his presence, like a shadow stretching across the room. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, as if time itself had stopped, waiting for the inevitable conclusion. Then, a low voice, almost a whisper, broke the darkness. "Laura, you were always destined to arrive here." The voice was calm, almost gentle, but laced with a hidden threat that chilled her to the bone. She turned slowly, trying to see where the voice was coming from, but the darkness was impenetrable. She felt as if she were being enveloped by something evil, something beyond her understanding. "You were never alone," the voice continued, moving like an echo around her. "I've been with you the entire time, watching, guiding your every step, every choice you made. I was there." Laura felt the terror inside her swell. The idea that he had been with her all along, like an invisible presence, was unbearable. Every moment she had felt alone, every decision made in desperation, had been manipulated, controlled by him. "Why?" she managed to ask, her voice weak, almost inaudible. "Why are you doing this to me?" The answer came immediately, as if he had been waiting for this question. "Because you needed to learn," he said, his voice cold as ice. "You needed to understand that there's no escape. You can run, you can fight, but in the end, it all comes back to the same place. Fear is a prison, Laura, and you're locked inside it." Laura felt tears stream down her face, mingling with the terror that gripped her. The hopelessness was overwhelming, as if each of his words were a sentence condemning her to a fate from which there was no escape. "But why me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What did I do to deserve this?" A deep silence followed her question. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, that he would leave her in that state of absolute terror without any explanation. But then he spoke again, his voice reverberating through the room. "Because you're strong, Laura. Stronger than you think. And that's what drew me to you. The strength you try to hide, the fear you fight to control. I wanted to see how far you could go, and I must say you've gone farther than most." His words were like knives, cutting away any hope she might have had. He had chosen her not for something she had done, but for who she was. and that made it all the more cruel, more merciless. "But the game needs to end," he said, with a calmness that terrified her. "And you know you can't escape." Laura felt the panic rising again, but also something else, a deep anger, born of despair. He had manipulated her life, played with her emotions, and now he was about to end it all, as if she were just a pawn in his sick game. But she wasn't willing to surrender so easily. "No," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I won't let you win." His laughter echoed through the room, cold and emotionless. "Win?" he repeated, almost amused. "Laura, this isn't a game you can win. It's a game you have to survive. And so far you've done very well. But the question is, how much longer can you hold on?" With those words, the faint moonlight illuminated a figure emerging from the shadows. He was there, finally revealed, but still shrouded in darkness, his face covered by a mask that reflected the light in a sinister way. Laura felt her heart pound wildly, the sight of him solidifying all her worst nightmares. "Let's see what you're capable of," he said as he slowly approached, each step echoing like a harbinger of what was to come. Laura knew this was the decisive moment. She could feel the fear trying to take over, but she also felt an inner strength growing, a fierce determination to fight until the end. He might be stronger, more calculating, but she wasn't ready to give in, not without a fight. And as he drew nearer, Laura realized that, despite everything, she still had a choice. She could give in to the terror that paralyzed her, or she could use the anger and strength that he so feared against him. And in that moment, she made her decision. Laura felt the cold spread through her body as the pursuer approached, each of his steps carrying an almost palpable weight. The mask he wore hid his features, but the eyes behind it gleamed with a malice that made Laura's stomach churn. He had finally revealed himself, and now there was no way to escape. But something inside Laura changed at that moment. The absolute terror that had held her hostage for so long began to transform into something different, an unshakable determination to survive. He had chosen her for her strength, and now she was about to show him that she wasn't just a pawn in his sick game. She took a few steps back, keeping her eyes fixed on him, feeling the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Her mind, once consumed by fear, now worked at full speed, searching for a way out of this situation. She knew brute force wasn't an option. He had the physical control, but Laura still had her intelligence and her will to fight. "You think you can defeat me, Laura?" His voice was calm, almost curious, as if he were enjoying the situation. "You still don't understand. This isn't about winning or losing. It's about how you deal with the inevitable." Laura didn't respond. Instead, she let the silence speak for her. With each passing second, she mentally prepared for what was to come. She looked around the hall, observing every detail, every possible escape. The piano in the center, the broken windows, the doors leading to other parts of the building. Each element was a piece on the board she needed to manipulate in her favor. He noticed her lack of response and advanced a few more steps, like a predator closing in on its prey. "Why aren't you saying anything, Laura? Are you accepting your fate? Or do you still believe you can escape?" It was at that moment that Laura acted. In one swift movement, she grabbed the piano lid and pulled it down with all her strength, causing the heavy cover to fall with a deafening crash, blocking his path for a brief instant. The sound echoed through the empty hall, reverberating off the walls and creating a moment of chaos that Laura took full advantage of. She ran for the nearest door, adrenaline propelling her movements, knowing she didn't have much time. She heard the sound of the piano lid being shoved aside and knew he was right behind her. Laura didn't look back. Her only chance was to keep moving forward, to find a way to escape before he caught up. The corridor she found on the other side of the door was even darker, her footsteps echoing on the worn wooden floor. The sensation of being pursued was intense, as if the very building was trying to capture her. But the sound of his footsteps behind her didn't cease, and with each passing moment, she felt time running out. Laura turned left, entering a dark and narrow room filled with old furniture covered in sheets. She slipped between them, trying to make as little noise as possible, knowing that any sound could give away her position. She stopped for a moment, panting, listening intently. He was getting closer, his footsteps now slower, more calculated. He knew she was nearby, and he was savoring the fear emanating from her. "You're making this more fun than I expected, Laura," he said, his voice sounding closer than she would have liked. "But you know this can't last forever." Laura felt a rising anger mixed with fear. He was playing with her, trying to break her will, but she wouldn't give in. She needed to find a way to turn the game around, to use the environment to her advantage. Then she noticed something. A narrow staircase in the corner of the room, leading to an upper floor. She had no idea where it led, but staying where she was wasn't an option. She ran for the staircase and began to climb, her steps quick and light, trying not to make noise. The sound of his footsteps increased as well, and she knew he had followed her. The narrow corridor above led to a small attic, where the moonlight filtered through a dirty window, illuminating the dusty space. Laura looked around, searching for an exit. The only option seemed to be the window, but it was at a dangerous height. Even so, it was better than facing the pursuer in a direct confrontation. She ran to the window, trying to open it, but the old and swollen wood made it difficult to move. "Do you really want to jump, Laura?" His voice echoed from the base of the stairs, and Laura felt despair tightening her chest. He was almost there, and she was still trapped in that attic, with no way out. Finally, with one last effort, she managed to open the window, feeling the cold night air hit her face. She looked down and saw the few meters that separated her from the ground. It was risky, but there was no choice. Before she could hesitate, Laura climbed onto the windowsill and jumped. The fall was quick, but the impact with the ground was painful, knocking the wind out of her lungs. She felt a sharp pain in her ankle, but didn't stop to assess the damage. She needed to get up, needed to keep moving. With difficulty, Laura dragged herself out of the window's reach, knowing he could follow at any moment. The pain in her ankle was intense, but fear drove her to continue. She limped along the side of the building, looking for a place to hide, to buy some time. In the distance, she heard the sound of glass shattering and knew he had jumped after her. The game of life and death continued, but Laura was still alive, and as long as she was breathing, she would keep fighting. And as she moved away from the building, disappearing into the shadows of the night, a single certainty took hold of her mind. She wouldn't be defeated so easily. Laura limped through the dark alley, the pain in her ankle radiating through her entire leg. Every step was agony, but the fear driving her was greater than the pain. She knew he was behind her, that the game was far from over. The sound of shattered glass crunching under his feet was a constant reminder that the chase was far from finished. She rounded a corner and found herself in an abandoned neighborhood where old houses lay in ruins, shadows dancing on the decaying walls under the dim light of the moon. Laura knew she couldn't run forever. She needed to find a place to hide, to catch her breath and think about her next move. But the despair was taking hold, and the feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle of terror was almost unbearable. In the distance, she saw an old church, the solitary structure rising against the night sky. The windows were broken, and the front door seemed to be hanging by a single rusty hinge. With no other options, Laura ran towards the church, hoping that somehow this place could offer the refuge she so desperately needed. She pushed the door with difficulty, and the sound of rusted metal echoed through the empty corridors. The interior of the church was shrouded in shadows, with broken pews scattered across the cold stone floor. The altar was covered in dust, and the remaining stained glass cast a diffuse and multicolored light, creating an almost supernatural effect. Laura limped to the back of the church, hiding behind one of the massive columns. Her heart pounded uncontrollably in her chest, and her breathing was ragged, as if she were inhaling her own fear from the air around her. She tried to calm her mind, desperately searching for a solution, but the terror was overwhelming. For a few minutes, everything was silent. The darkness around her seemed to pulse with its own energy, as if the church were alive, waiting for the events to unfold. Laura knew he was coming, that it was only a matter of time before he found her. The fear consuming her was absolute, and the echo of despair filled her mind, making it difficult to think clearly. Then she heard it again. The footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from the entrance of the church. He was there, hunting her, like a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to hide. With each step, Laura felt the terror intensify, as if the very air was closing in around her, trapping her in an invisible cage. Laura. His voice echoed through the empty space, laden with a disturbing calm. You can't hide forever. It's time to end this. Laura closed her eyes, trying to silence the panic that was overtaking her. She knew he was playing with her, savoring the fear she felt, but she also knew she had to fight, that she couldn't let him destroy her. The despair consuming her was beginning to turn into a cold anger, a determination that if she were to fall, she would fall fighting. She opened her eyes and looked around, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. She saw a broken piece of wood, a fragment of an old pew, and grabbed it with trembling hands. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She wasn't willing to surrender without a fight, even if the situation seemed hopeless. His footsteps echoed closer, reverberating off the walls of the church. Laura gripped the piece of wood tighter, trying to control her breathing. She knew she needed to stay calm, that any rash movement could be fatal. But the tension was about to break, and every second seemed to stretch to the limit, as if time itself was on the verge of shattering. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the decisive moment. Laura knew he was close, that he was about to make his final move. And in that moment, she decided to act. With a scream that was a mix of terror and rage, Laura emerged from her hiding place and ran towards the sound, wielding the piece of wood as a weapon. She didn't know if she would succeed, but she was determined to fight, not to surrender to the fear that had pursued her throughout that hellish night. She saw his shadow move, quick and precise, as if he had been expecting her reaction. But Laura didn't hesitate. She struck with all the strength she had, aiming where she imagined his face to be, or at least something that might throw him off balance. The sound of the impact reverberated through the church, followed by a moment of absolute silence. But then, a low, dark laugh filled the space around them. "Do you really think you can defeat me like this, Laura?" His voice was filled with a cruel calm. "You're stronger than I imagined, but you still don't understand. You can't stop me. This will end the way it was always meant to end." Laura stepped back, panting, the fear rising once again in her chest. His shadow seemed to grow taller, more imposing, as he slowly advanced towards her. The piece of wood fell from her hands, and she felt the panic take over once more. She was cornered, with no way out. Despair set in, and for a moment Laura felt that all was lost. But then, an idea formed in her mind. A last attempt, a final chance. She knew she couldn't defeat him physically, but maybe she could defeat him another way. He had said that everything came back to the same place, that fear was a prison. What if she refused to fear? What if, instead of running, she faced him head-on? "You don't control me," Laura said, her voice trembling, but full of a new determination. "You don't control anything, only fear. And I'm not afraid of you anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. He stopped, his imposing figure hesitating for a moment. Laura saw something change in his eyes, a shadow of doubt she hadn't seen before. And in that moment, she knew she had found the key. His power lay in the fear she felt, and now she was determined not to give him that power. She took a step forward, approaching the figure that had once terrified her. "It's over," she said, with a firmness that surprised even herself. "You can't hurt me. Not anymore." He retreated slightly, the cold confidence beginning to crumble. The laugh that had once been so threatening now sounded hollow, without strength. Laura watched as his mask of control began to crack, the truth behind the monstrosity starting to emerge. And as the moon illuminated the old church, Laura realized that the true power had been within her all along. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. The tension in the air was almost palpable as Laura stood firm before her pursuer. The darkness that once seemed to consume everything around now appeared to hesitate, as if losing its control over the environment. The figure before her, who had been a terrifying shadow, seemed to shrink, its threatening presence dissipating like mist in the sunlight. "You can't hurt me," Laura repeated, feeling a growing strength within herself. The anger, the despair, and the fear that had consumed her throughout the night were transforming into something more powerful, an unshakable determination. The pursuer, once so certain of his victory, now seemed to waver. He took a step back, as if being repelled by an invisible force. Laura realized that the fear he instilled in others was his only real weapon. Without it, he was nothing more than an empty shadow, a figure without substance. "This isn't possible," he murmured, his voice trembling for the first time. The mask that covered his face couldn't hide the doubt that now took hold of him. Laura saw that the cold and cruel confidence had disappeared, replaced by an uncertainty that once seemed impossible. "I said it's over," Laura continued, taking another step towards him. She no longer felt the terror that had once dominated her. Instead, she felt stronger, more confident. The presence that had once seemed omnipresent and overwhelming now seemed insignificant, almost pathetic. The pursuer retreated further, the shadow that enveloped him beginning to collapse. The church, once shrouded in darkness, began to slowly light up with the moonlight, revealing the details that had been hidden in the shadows. The old pews, the dusty altar, everything seemed different now, less threatening, more real. "You don't understand, Laura," he began, but his voice was weaker, without the strength it once carried. "This wasn't supposed to end like this." "But it does," Laura interrupted, her voice firm. "You have no more power over me. I'm not your victim anymore." With those words, something incredible happened. The figure of the pursuer began to fade, as if being pulled back into the shadows from which he had emerged. The mask, once a symbol of terror, fell to the ground with a hollow sound, and the face behind it was indistinct, as if he had never had a true identity. Laura watched as he disappeared, the body dissolving into mist, leaving only the fallen mask as the last vestige of his existence. The silence that followed was absolute, but unlike before, it wasn't oppressive. It was a silence of peace, of conclusion. She stood there, in the center of the church, her heart still pounding, but no longer from fear. She felt the weight of the night's events beginning to lift, as if an immense burden had been taken off her shoulders. Laura had faced her worst fears, and against all odds, she had won. For a long moment, she simply breathed, absorbing what had just happened. The church, now bathed in the soft light of the moon, seemed almost welcoming, offering her a moment of rest after the long and terrifying ordeal. Finally, Laura moved. With firm steps, she walked to the mask lying on the ground. She looked at it for a moment. The object that had symbolized so much terror now seemed insignificant, just a lifeless piece of material. With a resolute motion, she picked up the mask and threw it away, hearing the muffled sound as it rolled across the stone floor. The church door, once a heavy barrier, now felt light as Laura pushed it open. She stepped out into the cold night, feeling the fresh air against her face, a breeze that seemed to carry away the last vestiges of the terror she had experienced. The city was silent, peaceful, and for a moment, everything felt surreal, as if she were waking from a nightmare. But Laura knew it was real. Everything she had faced, all the fear, all the struggle, was part of her journey. And now, as she looked towards the horizon, towards the distant lights that signaled the beginning of a new day, she felt stronger, more alive than ever. She began to walk, leaving the church and the horrors of the night behind. The pain in her ankle was still there, but it now seemed small compared to what she had overcome. Every step she took was a step away from the nightmare and towards a new life, a life where she knew she was stronger than any fear she could face. And as she walked towards the dawn, a single truth resonated in her mind. She had won, and no one, not even the shadows of her past, could take that from her. As Laura walked through the deserted street, the city around her seemed to be slowly waking up, the first rays of sunlight beginning to light up the horizon. The terror of the night was still fresh in her mind, but she felt stronger, more determined to move forward. Each step took her farther from that nightmare, but a subtle unease began to creep into her thoughts, as if something was out of place. Despite the feeling of victory, something didn't seem right. Laura couldn't shake off a shadow that seemed to follow her, a distant echo of the previous night that refused to fade. The silence around her, once comforting, now seemed charged with a strange tension. It was as if the world around her was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She stopped for a moment, looking around. The streets were empty. The old buildings seemed to watch silently, and the air was heavy, as if something was about to reveal itself. Laura tried to ignore the feeling, but it was persistent, a ghostly presence that wouldn't leave her in peace. She decided she needed to go home, take a hot shower, and try to rest. She needed normalcy, something that could anchor her back to reality. But as she walked, each step seemed to echo louder, as if the sound was amplifying in the quietness around her. Something was wrong, something she couldn't identify. Finally, she reached the building where she lived, an old structure that now seemed strangely unfamiliar, as if she was seeing it for the first time. She entered the building and slowly climbed the stairs, the echo of her steps reverberating through the empty corridors. Everything was too calm, too quiet, and that disturbed her deeply. When she reached the door of her apartment, Laura hesitated. Something inside her told her not to enter, not to open that door. But she ignored the feeling, attributing it to the fatigue and trauma she had experienced. With a deep breath, she turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open. The interior of the apartment was exactly as she had left it, but the atmosphere seemed charged, heavy. The shadows were darker than usual, the furniture more distant, as if the space was distorting. Laura walked in slowly, closing the door behind her, but she didn't feel safe. Instead, the feeling of being watched, of being in danger, began to grow again. She walked into the living room, dropping her bag on the sofa, and stood still for a moment, trying to calm her mind. She needed to believe she was safe, that it was all over. But then something caught her attention. A subtle change in the room, almost imperceptible, but it made her blood run cold. On the coffee table, where there had been nothing before, was a mask. The same mask the pursuer had worn, the mask she had thrown to the ground in the church. It shouldn't be there, it couldn't be there. But there it was, a disturbing reminder that perhaps the nightmare wasn't truly over. Laura felt panic begin to resurface. The air seemed to disappear, the apartment walls closing in around her. The feeling of being watched, of being in danger, returned with overwhelming force. She took a step back, almost stumbling, unable to take her eyes off the mask. It couldn't be real. She had won. He had disappeared. So how was that mask there? Suddenly, a faint sound, almost inaudible, echoed through the apartment. Laura quickly turned, searching for the source of the sound, but saw nothing. The only thing moving was her own shadow, stretching in the dim light coming through the window. She tried to convince herself that she was imagining things, that it was just the trauma speaking louder, but the feeling that something was deeply wrong only grew stronger. The sound repeated, louder this time, coming from one of the rooms. Laura knew she shouldn't go there, that she should run out of the apartment and never look back. But something pushed her forward, a need to confront whatever was waiting for her. She picked up a heavy object from the table, a small metal statue, and began to walk towards the sound. The corridor seemed longer than usual, the shadows on the walls stretching like extended claws. Laura felt every beat of her heart, every breath caught in her throat. The persistent sound guided her, like a call she couldn't ignore. She reached the bedroom door, which was ajar, and pushed it open with the tip of the statue, her fingers trembling. The door opened slowly, revealing the dark and quiet interior. She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning every corner, looking for any sign of danger. Then she saw it. In the corner of the room, almost hidden by the shadows, something was moving. It was a crouched figure, indistinct, as if the darkness was solidifying around it. Laura felt panic rise like a wave, but she didn't back down. Instead, she gripped the statue tighter, prepared for whatever it was. "Who's there?" Her voice came out low, trembling, but full of a desperate determination. The figure didn't respond, but began to rise, the shadows stretching as it moved. And then, as the figure straightened, the faint light revealed a face. It wasn't the pursuer. It was something much worse. The face emerging from the shadows was hers. A distorted and malevolent version of herself. The eyes empty and lifeless, the mouth curling into a cold and cruel smile. Laura felt absolute terror take hold, her body frozen in place as she stared at her own image, now transformed into something horrific. The figure took a step forward, the smile widening, as if feeding on the fear Laura felt. The voice that came from its mouth was Laura's, but distorted, echoing like a nightmare. "You thought it was over, Laura? Thought you could escape me?" Laura couldn't respond, absolute terror paralyzing her. The figure continued to approach, each step a blow against Laura's sanity. And then, in a quick and brutal movement, the figure raised its arm, a black and amorphous shadow, and Laura knew it was the end. But before she could react, the figure dissipated, fading away like smoke in the wind. The room returned to normal, the shadows back in their place, and absolute silence fell over the apartment. The only thing left was Laura, trembling uncontrollably, the statue fallen from her hands, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She looked around, expecting another attack, but nothing happened. Everything was quiet, as if nothing had occurred. But the mask in the living room was still there, a persistent reminder that the nightmare might not be over. Laura knew she couldn't stay in that place any longer. She grabbed the mask with trembling hands and left the apartment, not knowing where she would go, but knowing she needed to leave, that the place was tainted by something terrible, something that wouldn't let her rest. And as she descended the stairs of the building, the mask firm in her hand, Laura felt a cold and harsh truth settle in her mind. The echo of the terror she had faced wouldn't disappear so easily. It would follow her, like a persistent shadow, a distorted reflection of everything she feared. And for the first time, Laura wondered if she would ever be truly free. Laura left the building as if fleeing a trap, her steps quick and uneven as she moved as far away as possible from that place that now seemed cursed. The sun was beginning to rise, but the light didn't bring comfort. On the contrary, it seemed to cast even longer shadows around her, distorting the reality she could barely recognize. The mask she held felt like it weighed a ton, as if it were imbued with all the terror she had faced the previous night. Every time she looked at the object, she felt a chill run down her spine, as if it were alive, pulsing with a sinister energy. Laura knew she needed to get rid of it, but the idea of simply discarding it filled her with an irrational fear, as if doing so could trigger something even worse. She continued walking, aimlessly, trying to find some semblance of normalcy. The streets were beginning to fill with people heading to work, living their lives as if nothing had happened. But for Laura, reality was unraveling, and every person who passed by seemed distant, unrecognizable, as if they were part of a world she no longer belonged to. Finally, she reached a park, a place that used to be a refuge for her on the most difficult days. The tall trees and the soft sound of the wind in the leaves had always calmed her, but today, even that place seemed different. The shadows under the trees were darker. The corners of the park seemed to hide secrets that shouldn't be uncovered. Laura found an isolated bench and sat down, finally allowing the tears she had been holding back to fall. The feeling of being watched still haunted her, a constant weight on her shoulders. All she wanted was a moment of peace, a second to breathe, without the constant fear that accompanied her. But even there, in what should have been a safe place, she felt his presence. Not as before, physical and threatening, but as a persistent shadow in her mind, an echo of the terror she had experienced. She closed her eyes, trying to focus on her breathing, trying to convince herself that she was safe. But the sound of the wind in the trees sounded like whispers, and the rustling of the leaves seemed laden with hidden meanings. She opened her eyes and looked at the mask in her hands. The object, though inanimate, seemed to pulse with an energy Laura couldn't understand. The idea of throwing it away was tempting, but something inside her prevented her from doing so, as if the mask was connected to her in a way she couldn't explain. It was then that she noticed something strange. The shadows around her, which had previously seemed merely natural, began to move unnaturally. The dark shapes seemed to stretch, reaching out to her as if they were coming to life. Laura froze, the terror returning in full force, and the feeling that something was terribly wrong intensified. The shadows weren't natural. They were being manipulated, guided by an invisible force that Laura was beginning to understand. The pursuer, or what was left of him, was trying to return, trying to claim what he believed to be his. The mask, the symbol of all the terror she had faced, was the anchor that tied him to her. Laura stood up abruptly, her heart racing, and began to walk quickly through the park, but the shadows followed her, extending with every step. Desperation grew inside her, and the only thing she could think of was that she needed to get rid of the mask, needed to cut the connection before it was too late. She ran towards a lake in the center of the park, her steps clumsy and rushed as the shadows seemed to engulf her. The sound of her own footsteps and her ragged breathing echoed in her mind, mixed with the whisper of the leaves and the rustling of the trees. It was as if the world was disintegrating around her, and the only thing left was the terror that pursued her. When she reached the edge of the lake, she looked down at the dark water, her own reflection distorted and undefined. Without thinking twice, she raised the mask over her head, ready to throw it into the water and end it all, once and for all. But before she could act, she felt something cold and tight around her wrist, as if the shadows had gained physical form and were trying to stop her. Laura fought against the invisible force, the terror and anger mixing as she tried to free herself from what was holding her. She knew she couldn't hesitate, that this was her only chance. With a desperate cry, she used all her strength and threw the mask into the lake, watching it disappear beneath the surface of the water. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The shadows around her hesitated, as if confused, and the feeling of being watched began to diminish. Laura fell to her knees on the lake's shore, exhausted and trembling, looking at the water where the mask had disappeared. The lake's surface quickly calmed, and Laura's reflection returned to being just hers. No trace of the mask, no distorted shadow. She stayed there for a while, trying to recover, trying to convince herself that it was finally over. The park around her began to seem normal again, the shadows returning to their natural places and the sunlight finally bringing some warmth. But Laura knew deep down that the scars from that encounter wouldn't disappear so easily. The echo of the terror was still inside her, a persistent reminder that evil can take many forms, and that, even when defeated, it can leave deep marks. She slowly stood up, feeling the pain in her ankle return, but this time she was ready to keep going. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that she would have to face the remnants of that nightmare for a long time. But she also knew that she had survived, that she had faced the terror head-on and come out the other side. As she walked away from the lake, leaving the park and the shadows that had once pursued her behind, Laura felt a new determination grow inside her. The nightmare was over, but life went on, and now more than ever, she was ready to face it.